tale to give each side's version of this an exclusive one, we understand. One of the most talked about.
Hello, Mr. Timothy Phillips. How are you?
I am well. Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining me, and I want to thank you for joining, these smaller podcasting shows. I really think it's a great service you're doing, and I really appreciate your time. I really do.
Happy to be here. Let's get started.
I want to start off with just a short introduction, and to do it proper, I have my notes here. So, Mr. Timothy Phillips, I'm sorry, I hope I can call you Tim.
Of course,
is the former acting director of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, as we know it as AARO, the Pentagon's lead agency for investigating unidentified anomalous phenomena, with over 4 decades of service in the national intelligence community and a decorated Marine Corps career, including deployments to Iraq, Somalia, and Lebanon. Mr. Phillips brought military discipline and analytical rigor to one of the most controversial missions in recent U.S. history. This morning, we will explore not just the facts behind the headlines, but the mechanisms and the motivations that shape the national UAP conversation. And I think that's interesting because after I did all of my show prep, I fed it, into ChatGPT, and I said, give me an introduction. And I noticed that it used the word mission as if it picked up on my controversial, my sort of conspiratorial look on, about this. So I thought that was interesting that it used the word mission, as in, AARO was a mission,
It absolutely is a mission.
So what I really like to do with guests first is to understand a little bit about their history. And I noticed during my research that you were a decorated Marine Corps retiree. And I have a special place in my heart for vets. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that and maybe, one of your most memorable moments from your career.
Sure. Well, I grew up in an Air Force family. My father was a flight engineer, flew with both the Strategic and the Tactical Air Command. The first 18 years of my life, I spent 9 of them overseas. I started school in the UK when my father was flying KB-50s and refueling bombers during the Cold War. So that was my first overseas experience as Air Force dependent. During the Vietnam War, during the 1960s, all the way up through 1970 as a kid, going to DoD schools overseas. We lived on the island of Guam for almost 6 years during the Vietnam War as my father deployed and flew combat missions from the island of Guam. He did both air rescue and he was doing tactical air reconnaissance missions and a lot of deployments out of South Asia. So I grew up in a military family. My father was originally from San Francisco, the Bay Area. Didn't really like some of the changes going on there, so he decided to relocate his family to Tucson, Arizona. And I was able to spend a little bit of time in elementary school, 6 months in junior high, 1 year in high school there. And I spent 4 years at the University of Arizona. I was a hometown kid and I went to school there. My father had actually talked to me about, maybe I should consider the Air Force Academy and apply for that. But I wore corrective lenses and you had to have 20/20 vision. And I didn't have that. I was close, so I was never going to be an aviator in the Air Force. And in my father's opinion, if you were an aviator, if you can't fly, don't go in the Air Force. And that was kind of his opinion. But I really got into martial arts, a little bit of boxing as a kid in Tucson. And we had a football game and the University of Arizona won. And we were in a bar called the Green Dolphin the south of the university, and I ran into this really, really unusual man I've never met before. He was actually a Marine officer selection officer. He was an OSO, recruiter for the Marine Corps. Met him in a bar, and he basically challenged our manhood. There was three of us that were doing a lot of intramural sports there, and basically, if I can say this word, said we had no hair on our scrotum unless we went to this place called 2 Leaders Course at Quantico, Virginia, this exotic place called Quantico in Virginia. And at the time, I was working at the Triple T truck stop, servicing trucks and fixing tires, and between El Paso and Tucson. And I thought, well, I could spend all summer out there on that hot pavement working on trucks, or I could, have a summer vacation and go to Quantico, go to officer candidate school. So 3 of us went in together. We had the academic, chops and physically fit enough to go. And it was probably the most challenging thing I ever did in my life, to go down to Quantico and prove my mettle and my potential to be a Marine officer. So I learned a lot down there. Actually survived the course. Of the 3 of us who went together, I was the only one after college who actually accepted a commission. And on the 5th of July, 1979, in my parents' living room, I was sworn in as a lieutenant of Marines. And I ended up going to Quantico and learned how to be a Marine officer at the Marine Corps basic school. We keep things very simple. And I was at the basic school. Due to my ASVAB score, I did really well with like electrical theory aptitude. And they decided that I need to be a communication electronics officer. And that's where I went off to follow on school. And during this time, 79, 80, we had the crisis there in Iran, where a bunch of revolutionaries took over our embassy and was holding Americans hostage for 444 days. So that was the environment that I was in as a young lieutenant, learning how to become a Marine officer. And we all thought, after we got out of our MOS schools, that we'd be deploying to war. That was the environment. When Ronald Reagan became president, the hostages were released. It would never have that, but it was interesting throughout my career in the various schools I attended. I think there was 3 times I actually was doing campaign planning to go in there and seize Chabahar, the Straits Hormuz. Just part of war planning. So long familiarity with the Iranians and the threat there. And as we talk here today, we just had this amazing campaign that the Israelis did, and our involvement was in it. It seems my entire life that was kind of our generation, the focus. And then after 9/11, you had the war on terrorism. But I went in the Marine Corps, just a kid from Tucson, Arizona, to get to be part of the Marine Air Ground Task Force, be part of that Navy expeditionary groups, and be able to travel the world and be that force in readiness. Was absolutely amazing. I got to go to some very, very exciting places. And it seemed like throughout my career, I was in the wrong place at the right time. So my first combat deployment was in Lebanon, in Beirut. So I was there early on, and actually, in 82, and then left there in January of 83. But
were you there during the bombing of the?
No, I was not. That happened in the fall of 83. Now, a Marine officer that I actually we shared a stateroom on board the USS Saipan, was killed in the blast. So I had a lot of friends I lost. Was very, very familiar with what the press called the Marine Barracks. That was actually the Trans-Mediterranean Airline corporate headquarters building that I helped survey. And the reason that the battalion landing team moved in there is because it provided overhead cover. And during the Peace for Galilee campaign, when Israel went up there and went after the PLA had actually used that building as a medical aid station. So due to the overhead cover, and that's the same reason we were out there. So the Marines were protecting the airport. Not the best place to be to protect the airport. It's not necessary to occupy it, but maybe control the key terrain and the avenue approach to the airport. But we're stuck down there around the airport. And weekly, you had Marines being killed and wounded for indirect fire. So the opposition was up in the hills in the chutes, Mount Lebanon up above us, shooting down at us. So they decided, hey, if you're out there as part of the security perimeter and force protection, if you weren't on duty, we'd have you sleep, be fed in the building. It was solid. It was a modern reinforced concrete building and would give adequate protection against 107 fire or 81 or 82 millimeter fires that were coming in around that perimeter. So I was not there at the time of the attack. A lot of Americans don't realize that those series of attack, the very first VBED or car bomb attack occurred at Red Beach. And I think it was October of '82. And the only people harmed, I think we had one sailor that was injured, but it was only Lebanese who were injured or killed by that initial attack. And then we had the American Embassy in April. We had Americans who were working at the remnants of the staff there, the American Embassy staff, was relocated to the British compound, and then they were attacked there. And then we had both the French, the Foreign Legion base, and the Battalion Landing Team was attacked there in October of '83. So, yeah, it was a bad day for the Marine Corps. I think if the Marine Amphibious unit commander had an opportunity on how to protect that his perimeter and keep his Marines safe, we would have had different choices, but there were some political considerations about keeping the airport open and not interfering with commerce. But yeah, that was it. But as a result of serving in Beirut, there weren't a lot of lieutenants who actually had opportunity to serve in a combat zone. I was one of them, but I was able to, actually have a career in the Marine Corps, and I stayed for about 21 years. And it was just absolutely amazing to have that experience. I was a company commander during the Gulf War, and just being there and the preparation for that. I remember part of my job was I would get the air tasking order every night, because I was always working evenings. Most of the action happened at night, and I tended to work my 12-hour shift. When I was working, tended to be in the evening. And I remember we were trying to get the air tasking order from headquarters down there in the JFAC, the coordinated commander for all air operations. And I remember the officer on the line said, "Hey, where are you?" And I said, "Well, we're up here on the border with Kuwait." And he said, "Go out and look south." And I went out there, and that's where all the aircraft were heading into, Iraqi and Kuwaiti airspace. They still had the lights on. They were tanking, and they were turning them off. And it was just a massive air armada. And that's the reason we on the ground didn't get that air tasking order that day, because they had other plans and other missions they had to perform. But being there, fighting that battle, and then getting into Kuwait City and doing some of the exploitation, the recovery of foreign capabilities was my first venture into that world, and spent a lot of time following cable and fiber and going to underground command, facilities, trying to understand what technologies, who provided the technology. During one of the battles, we're out there in the Manifa oil fields, and I kept on hearing the generator. You had the roar of all these oil fields, and these derricks on fire, and the rush of gas, and at times we had raw crude up over our ankles. It seems like it was pretty bad environments, like Dante's Inferno, and it caused its own weather effect. Having all that soot, all that petrochemicals in the air was causing lightning, and it was raining oil. We were all filthy out there, but as we were securing, as we were doing a tactical move, kept on hearing a generator. I knew it wasn't us because we were still in our armor, but looked over and started to see the movement of a radar, and then realized that it was a counter radar system that was still operating that the Rockies were using against us. And we assaulted it, and we were able to capture the plots of what the Iraqi operators were viewing against our artillery. That was pretty neat. And matter of fact, after the war, I went back to that location and towed that Sinclair, the British piece of kit that the Iraqis were using, and towed that back to Saudi Arabia. And it was sitting in a museum at Camp Pendleton for many, many years. But that was one of my contributions to the war. And I got involved in a couple of medevacs. We had a thing called a plugger. So we had early precision navigation and timing. We were able to understand where we were with precision, so we could do strikes, call artillery, airstrikes, or we could actually be in a known location because the visibility was so bad, and be able to allow medevac flights come in and evacuate wounded Marines. So that's one of the things I was really proud of, and I understand, from talking to buddies who are actually flying those medevac flights, that the guys that we were able to, during the battle, get evacuated actually survived. So I was pretty proud of that fact. So that was
sorry.
My Marine career had nothing to do with aliens, or scientific research. I did when I was working at headquarters of Marine Corps. I was asked, if I would voluntarily, as a brand new major, if I would volunteer for a program. There's a SAP program, a highly controlled program, and I said, "Sure, what is it?" And we said, "Well, we can't tell you. You're gonna have to go get right into it." And that's how I kind of got into, the special access programs, learned a little bit more about the capabilities of our country and what we were doing. So that was early on in my career, in my tour at headquarters Marine Corps, and they introduced me to that world of exploitations of new capabilities.
I was wondering how the military moves people from, that original sort of battlefield scenario to the intelligence side of things, and it kind of leads me to my next question. I've tried to figure out how to formulate this question for quite some time, but looking back on 2017 and up to this, this current period. I was sort of a child of the 70s, a teenager in the mid 70s, and I became interested in, science fiction and UFOs and all that. How you become interested at that age, and I've seemingly lived through several what I call hype cycles, and I've always been interested in. I guess the first one I really remember was after the F-117 was rolled out. And, you heard rumors of that machine being invisible or, to radar. And, when it's rolled out, you realize it's just, has a small radar cross section. So there was lots of, myths and, rumors about that type of technology before it was rolled out. And when it finally it was sort of a future shock, right? But it wasn't, it was understandable at that point. And I wonder, this since 2017, it seems like we've, I guess my question is, what do you think the motivation was for this current era, this, from 2017 to now? It seems like that this cycle's coming not to a close, but it's winding down a little bit in my mind. What do you think the original motivation was for the current hype cycle? Is that an appropriate question? Is that a
Sure.
question?
I don't think I'm qualified to talk about a person's motivation for being interested in the phenomena, but I do know that there were some advancements in our ability to sense and understand that was up there. So a lot of most of the Air Force and Navy and Marine Corps attack and fighter aircraft were upgraded with new digital radar capabilities. They went from analog and using dishes that scanned to a digital ability to go out there and sense the environment around their aircraft. So the fidelity and the computing power greatly increased. So now our production aircraft, the stuff, the things we had in the fleet, was much more capable now of detecting things that were always there, but now that they could sense them. And I think we had a lot of good reporting from aviators that were seeing strange things. The Nimitz, carrier battle group workup in 2004, there was some real anomalies going on there detected by both aircraft. And then we had the Spy 1B radar on the USS Princeton, an amazing, radar was able to find some things that we didn't understand. Third Fleet, that was actually, the staff was afloat at that time, knew there were some unusual things, occurring, actually had disrupted some of the training and evaluation and had ordered that the data be preserved, on both, the radar data and the plots and stuff that was going on with the Nimitz, so they could understand, what just happened. So the data made it back to San Diego. It was carried back, and from San Diego was forwarded to Doggerland, Virginia, where they're going to do the exploitation. AARO working with the CNO's office, there were 2 physical searches conducted trying to get that data so we could, use our current understanding of how those systems work and our understanding of those anomalies to be able to scientifically, evaluate what happened. We could not find that data. After 2 physical searches, we could not find it. And even probably more frustrating, as we had more witnesses came forward and were sharing, their understanding and their firsthand observations of what occurred, is we went back and we wanted to look at the flight logs, the journals. If we were underway, that there's a log that's maintained. It has all the significant events. We could not find any of those documents in the archives. So when there was a claim that a helicopter landed at the USS Princeton and people in black jumped off, went into the captain's stateroom and recovered a bunch of data and documents and material and left, that was witnessed by the crew. And later on, we found out that actually happened. And we had one of our officers on the AARO staff was at a cocktail party in Old Town Alexander and was introduced to the former director of DARPA, and they started talking about that case. And actually, we found out that it was actually some DARPA scientists that actually went out to the Princeton and recovered some kit, because they were supporting a small ISR system that was still being protected, that was still covert. And most people who are involved with that training exercise did not understand and had no need to know what that system was.
But I guess that's part of my question, or that answers part of my question, really, because you have one group taking that incident and saying, well, they're covering up, UFOs, and then we find out that they're just trying to protect a new censoring, signal intelligence type equipment, right?
Right.
There's no, so you know what I mean? There's always sort of two stories happening simultaneously, and it's hard to filter, what actually is going on, because you'll have one side, and this has been sort of a pattern. Sorry, I keep knocking my microphone. It's sort of a pattern since 2017. You'll have a video released. You'll have a story surrounding it. You'll have people like Jeremy Corbell pushing the UFO narrative, but then behind the scenes, you might learn that it had more to do with,
protecting sources and
methods, and the way you collect data, right? Because the hard drives were removed by DARPA, correct?
They weren't hard drives. That it was part of, I believe it was called a WASP system, which they were supporting. So they went back to the Princeton to recover their kit, is what they were doing.
Yeah.
And it was unusual to have civilians in these black jumpsuits come out there and go to the captain's stateroom while that warship was underway. That was unusual, to the crew, and the crew would witness it. They didn't know who they were or why they were there or what they were doing. But the fact that they reported what they saw accurately is a fact, and AARO, as we had this claim, we had a story, we had a witness, but just because a witness says it's true, then we want to uncover evidence to support their claims. And that's what our job is, and that's what any responsible, professional investigative organization is going to do. We're like, when the aviators come up and say they saw something, we believe that, but what we want to do is get the data, the metadata, to actually understand what it was. And what was frustrating for us is we had these enthusiasts that were leaking without authorization, sensitive, maybe not classified sensor data, but they were leaking things to the press unlawfully. And it was very, very frustrating because in some cases people did knowingly leak classified data. That's a crime. That should not be happening because we want to protect these systems and capabilities. Another, fact, at the time when a lot of these stories were going on, you had some activity off the Virginia Capes, you had stuff going off the West Coast, you had a lot of surveillance that was being leaked from forward operating bases in both Iraq and Afghanistan. As you know, we had cameras out there. We had ISR systems that were on dirigibles. These, the T-PEDs were up there monitoring what was going on, and people would see something unusual they didn't understand, and little clips were being leaked to the press.
Like the jellyfish.
Yeah, the claims of the jellyfish, which.
Yeah.
When we were able to work on that case, the way we have to do security reviews, and then go to the original classifier of those tapes. In that case, the visuals of what occurred, and we had that gaggle of partially deflated balloons that was going by the camera. You have to go back to the unit, that commander, and ask them, was there anything in the field of room that, the field of view that we had to protect? Was their presence there something that we wanted to conceal? Was there any aspects of the sensor that collected that data that we wanted to protect? And you're going back into the war zone where we had these bases, when you had revolving numbers of commanders who were there for their 6-month or 1-year tour, trying to go back to find out who was in control at that base when that tape, was made, and someone without authority leaked that to the press. It was very, very frustrating for us because AARO is not the original classification authority. We have to go back to the organization that took that imagery and work with them to ensure that we do not inadvertently leak something that could hurt our national security, because when you declassify something, there's only one opportunity to do it right.
Yeah, I interviewed Michael Sinkowski. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but I think he was the actual Marine who saw the jellyfish on the scope,
on the screen.
Yeah, and the screen, and he basically told me that it wasn't anything anomalous. That so I don't know. I keep you with the. My UFO friends are in the chat, so I have to be careful what I say. But you always have these two narratives running simultaneously with this type of thing, and it's hard to it's hard for an objective person to really zero in on what's going on. And I'm just wondering, like, just for example, what is your opinion of the Tic Tac? Was it our own technology testing pilots, or was it something anomalous?
Go back to that particular case. I was briefed on it. A lot almost all of those historical examples is it's kind of part of the canon of UAP and UAP lore. A lot of the source data, okay, we never had to actually go back and examine simultaneously to understand. So we would have the system that captured that activity, and then AARO would look for other sensor input. It could be from national technical means, the sensors that we have in space. It could be from a air surveillance radar or a maritime radar, or a weather radar. It could be a space surveillance radar. It could be a ring camera that was in the field of view and picked up that activity. Whatever it is, we're always looking for other sensors that can help us confirm. First of all, the track, what happened, kind of capture the characteristics of what it was, and then we go back and look at the weather. We seek other witnesses who may be there. How did it look from their perspective? AARO would do peer-reviewed science where we would have a case, we look at the evidence that was available, and I'll give Sean Kilpatrick, a credentialed scientist that actually came from the missile defense and space world with an amazing amount of experience and expertise as a scientist. As we looked at things with two tracks, so we gave it to the scientists to let them solve what they thought happened. And then we had an amazing team of analysts who were working for a senior intelligence service executive from CIA that was running our analytical directorate. So they took two approaches. So you had IC analysts looking at a case, and then you had scientists looking at a case independently of each other. And then we would get together the reconciliation and see if we came to the same conclusion. Often 80%, 85%, we did. There was agreement on what we thought it was. And then we always followed IC analytic standards where we would give our justification for the degree of confidence we had in making that, assessment. We would follow, the standards on how that was done. And when it came to the science aspect, it was all peer-reviewed science where there was a lot of double-blind tests and people looked at the data independently of our scientists to see if they had, they were in agreement on what we discovered.
I guess I was hoping, since you're retired now, you could give me your opinion of what the Tic Tac was.
There were so many cases, and I let them do their job. I let the analysts and the scientists do their job, and they would come to me and say, "Hey, this is what we think we would do it," and then we would approve it. And then we would publish it at whatever classification level we could. I forgot if we ever went public with Tic Tac and it's on the website or not. So I really don't want to comment on what it was. I remember them briefing me.
It's interesting, though, because I interviewed another fella. His nickname is Tic Tac Guy. He was a maintenance tech at some base in the Virgin Islands. Actually, I have to go back. It's a couple of years ago now. But he claims he saw a human pilot in a Tic Tac type vehicle, craft. And I had another fella who was a retired Air Force guy who I'm going to interview, who claims the same thing. And so, I hear more witness testimony from people saying this is human tech than I do UFOs. So that's why I'm interested in what people like you think about. And I know you probably still have NDAs, or you still have to honor your secrecy on some things.
Those are a lifelong obligation, and
yeah,
I respect it on, and I'm going to comply with those NDAs that I signed. One of the things that was almost universal when witnesses would come forward, or we would have people from Congress that seemed to have some insight, firsthand knowledge of a UAP incident, they'd come in and they would be interviewed by our team of strat debriefers, intel officers, and we had a lot of credentialed federal law enforcement officers that did criminal investigations on the staff. We found that their observations were accurate. They would come in and say, hey, we had this incident. To me, it looked like an alien spacecraft. Not sure what it was. It was in a highly secret area, and they were doing this. And a lot of them referred to us by Congress. AARO, by the law, was directed to put in a secure reporting mechanism for DoD. Our contractors, retired or active, could report misbehavior by the government, where you had programs that were never briefed to Congress. So they were withheld from Congress unlawfully, and they could not perform their oversight role. So we put together a mechanism so people could come forward where we could protect their identity. We could waive them of their NDA so they could share with us their observations, and then we would remind them that those NDAs were lifelong obligations. And then we would go off and investigate the case and find collaborating evidence to support their claims. And one thing that was almost universal is the descriptions of what they saw were very, very accurate. People were talking about unusual behavior of some of these advanced systems that were being tested by their government. We would go to the test directors, we go in the archives, we look at the videos and the reports, and almost universally, they were accurate. However, their assessments were wrong. These people were lawfully present. However, they were not witting. They were not read into those programs. They were not part of the development of that capability. So based off their education, worldview, and beliefs, they may think that was alien technology. But for all the cases that I was privy to, those were capabilities developed by your government and our friends. And they were absolutely amazing. I remember there was a very, very senior member of Congress, committee chair, that was concerned about a compromise in security and the security leak on one of our 6th generation aircraft capabilities. And he had asked me if I had been out to Nevada, the Nevada test site, and I had an understanding of what we were doing there. And I said, well, I've been briefed on it. And he said, no, you need to go out there, in person, to get a comprehensive understanding of what's going on out there and the capabilities that we're developing. And based off that recommendation, I did. I got in the program, flew out there. And the things that we saw were absolutely amazing. And now I understand why these witnesses came forward claiming that we had, alien technologies that we were testing. Well, they weren't from aliens. They were developed by humans, engineered and fielded and tested by, our people. But I understand their worldview. I understand why it was so bizarre and so unusual they would believe that.
One thing that interests me the most is that, especially since the current Wall Street Journal article has come out, that I feel like I always have to do this disclaimer in my shows. I believe that in the possibility of life out there. I believe in that possibility. But in this case, in these particular cases, I'm not sure that that's what we're seeing. And those two things can exist simultaneously, right?
I believe so, and one of the things that Sean initiated, and I continue, and John, has followed the same process and procedure. When we selected people, and AARO had the opportunity to hire some of the best and brightest our country has. If people were in one of two camps, disbelief that an alien life form could never be here, or it could happen. Aliens are not real just because of the time distance challenges that we have in God's universe. It just could not happen. On the other hand, we had people who automatically defaulted to an alien visitors. They were biased in their opinions, and that's not what we wanted on the staff. We wanted people that are open-minded and allow the evidence, to drive our assessments and conclusion.
I think that's part of the irony of this is that people who, claim these are UFOs, I don't want to say they're not. I consider people who are more open-minded are the people who are willing to falsify their own work, right?
I wouldn't know about it. I think they're honest. People didn't know what they were, but they were.
I don't mean they're not. I don't mean they're not being honest. I believe people believe that they believe. They're not lying because they believe what they believe, right? But
Correct.
if you want to take a scientific approach, you have to be able to falsify your own work, right? You can't. You got to be open. Open mindedness is not. I believe it's UFOs. Open mindedness is. I believe it could be UFOs or human tech. You know what I mean? That's where I'm coming from, I guess.
Yeah.
And if you follow, excuse me, if you follow, organizations, I guess DARPA is an NGO, right? They're a defense contractor, right?
DARPA is a government organization
It's
that
okay.
develops.
I'm thinking of organization or companies like Palantir or Anduril,
Andrew.
Palmer,
Oh, yeah, okay.
Palmer Lucky, those type of people. I'm just saying, if you follow those people and you watch how advanced the technology is now, look at the Manta Ray project by DARPA. It looks like an underwater UFO, but
Absolutely.
it just went public not too long ago, right? Showed maybe they were renderings of it, maybe they weren't images, but this thing can travel underwater very fast, and so I guess I don't know. I'm not sure where I was going with that. I think it's just to try to remind people that you almost have to follow technology, human technology, at the same time as you're following your other beliefs.
And that's why we spent so much time working with defense contractors, the people that produce these prototypes and these advanced capabilities, the Lucky Skunk Works, working with IARPA, the Intel version of DARPA, going into the service research labs, working with the service and agency, analytical centers and S&T labs. We needed to understand what was possible. So they have like a scale called a technology readiness scale. So and AARO actually paid for some experimentation because we were getting reports of non-conventional, control surfaces on aircraft. People would see something and say, hey, it did not have conventional control surfaces. And we were thinking, what could that be? So we actually work with the Air Force Research Labs and say, can you help us understand what's possible? And maybe there's been, a breakthrough or an adversary has fielded a new capability that someone has detected and it's been reported as UAP. One of the things that I always felt uneasy about is the amount of resources and time that AARO was given by its government to research this phenomena, and we weren't finding aliens. However, we were contributing to intelligence production and understanding of adversary capability. So one of the things I was really proud of is we had a case where we had U.S. aircraft were picking up unusual signatures out there in the Western Pacific, close to China and within the first island chain. They were picking up some really unusual things that we didn't understand. And they reported to us as UAPs, because one of the things that we want to do is remove the stigma of reporting and actually have the aviators report unusual activity. They don't understand. Hey, can you call real quick? My dog just came down here and I got to let him out or we're going to have a problem. Okay.
Okay.
It'll take me 15 seconds. I'll be right back.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, come on. Let's go.
So I am trying to keep up with the comments, and I appreciate all the questions, and I'm going to try to work with them in. And I do watch the comments as we're doing this show, so I appreciate everybody that's here. And I have so many questions for Tim.
I am sorry for that. It's real world, but my dog just woke up and he needed to get outside.
I was trying to fill the dead air. Thank you.
We did that.
Let me get into a subject, because I know we only have a little bit, like an hour and a half. So,
sure.
And this is a big question, but it's leading to a smaller question. Okay, I know that the CIA is not allowed to run, psychological operations on American citizens, correct?
I would say nobody in the government could do that without
unless they're affiliated with
authorization.
terrorism or whatever. There's like some loopholes there, right?
Disinformation campaigns, sure.
But
We don't want to use all the tools of our government that we use against our adversaries, against our people.
But I mean, does that, isn't it possible though for, like, say, what am I going to call them, NGOs or special interest groups, or I hate to use the word grifters, but it's a word. What's another word?
Use of cover story?
Maybe intelligent subcontractors. Is it possible for there to be people who have formed their own sort of motivations, and these are the people that seem to be, because I mean, you don't see, I guess maybe I'm just I'm just a redneck from Tennessee, and I think about conspiracies too much. But if you look at the whole picture from 2017, there seemed to be this concerted effort to leak the videos, take those videos, create a narrative around them. There was never any scientific effort. There was always the UFO angle. There was never the angle of let's look at both sides of this story, right? There was an obvious attempt to convince the American people that these were UFOs. And if I guess maybe am I the only one seeing that?
A primary, part of AARO's mission is to prevent technological and operational surprise. So AARO's out there. We may not find AAROs or aliens. However, we did detect UASs, or what the public calls drones. We have UAP reports that we resolved as new adversary capabilities that is now part of serialized intelligence production. So AARO does contribute to our understanding of the fielding of new capabilities and new systems. Often when we have a UAP report, we have to go back and say, is it one of our systems? Is this something that we're testing that was detected, or is this, does it have some type of prosaic or natural explanation of what was detected? Or could this be an adversary system? And what AARO will do is gather all the evidence and try to figure it out. We want to protect our methods and sources. When AARO actually puts out sensors to try to understand the phenomena, often we pick up things that we want to protect, and we're going to do our best in that aggregated data, not to give away our crown jewels. When we got something that we've detected we don't understand, especially if those incidents occurred in sensitive locations, such as the national test sites or nuclear weapons were concerned, that goes to the top of our priorities, because what is it, whatever it is, shouldn't be there. And the fact that, we couldn't deter it or was detected late, that's a national security concern to us. We need to understand that the world is too dangerous of a place to have something operate in close proximity to critical infrastructure that we don't understand. We can't afford
well, I agree.
a mistake.
I agree, and I'm a very patriotic person. I agree that the purpose of our government is to protect our country and to keep secrets that they're based rely on national security relies on. At the same time, it's strange that there seems to be these sort of special interest groups that create these narratives that almost seem organized in some way. I mean, and they I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, I remember the first time I interviewed Louis Elizondo, and shortly after that, he said, in another interview, I'm a counter intel guy. I'm not a UFO guy. I'm a counter intel guy. And this started a whole thought process by some people. Well, me too, but that maybe there was a group of people that were hired to do public, not misinformation or disinformation. I hate that those words are really strong, but and this links back to the idea of, are there groups that can do these campaigns on the American public, that are exempt from the laws,
They're not exempt from the
surrounding.
laws. What they do may be done in violation of the laws. And there's a few examples of AARO's and its investigations where we found misbehavior by the government. And that was promptly reported to congressional oversight in our chain of command within the executive branch of government. But, we talked a little bit in a phone call before we went live, but we actually did have a witness who came forward, a very credible witness, a retired Air Force general that had shared with us when he was the commander out there, what the public calls Area 51. He actually delivered photographs of, his range with the traditional, 1960s UFOs. And though that portfolio was delivered, to a enthusiast that was running a bar and a restaurant out there by Area 51. Was that part of a disinformation, campaign to kind of focus the UFOs enthusiasts' attention away from the fact that they were actually developing stealth aircraft, and by continuing to feed the myth that we had alien spaceship flying around Area 51s, they'd be looking for that and not the development of advanced stealth aircraft that was being tested and flown out there at that time. Now,
Are you speaking about Rick Doty and the Paul Benowitz story, that type of thing?
No, I'm talking a retired Air Force officer that was asked by security personnel to deliver a portfolio of photographs of alien spaceships operating in the airspace out there at the Nevada test site.
You mentioned that it was around the time that the F-117
was being developed. Yes.
Yeah, that's similar. That's in the same era as the Paul Benowitz story, which I always thought that was what he was seeing, was the F-117, testing of that.
Sure. And when I was in the UK, meeting with our Commonwealth partners there, the Ministry of Defense, they actually showed us a version of a report that they were tasked to do by their government, and they assessed that the majority of UFO sightings in the UK by their citizens was observations and detections of U.S. advanced aircraft that were not yet in the public, that were being detected. These things are not invisible, and that's, they thought was the basis for the majority of the cases that they had. And CIA did an assessment in the early 60s. They came up with the same conclusion. The public was looking at the XB-70, the U-2, aircraft flying at heights, well beyond the capabilities of conventional aircraft at that time. And that's what the public was seeing.
I guess you have people, I mentioned Rick Doty. He's pretty popular on, X right now in Spaces, talking about, about that era and the way, the types of information that they, manipulated people with at that time. I mean, he's admitting to this, and he also talks about the working group, that he's involved with now. So it's kind of strange, what I mean? It's almost as if it's kind of strange to hear that speak, and then not have people paranoid that there are, misinformation campaigns happening, when you have people on social media in Spaces admitting, talking about it and admitting to it. So
sure.
it's kind of hard it's hard to separate,
We had hard evidence. We actually worked with the Air Force, Air Force Secretary and the IG on the Yankee Blue incident, where You had a legitimate training tool that was used to indoctrinate and train administrators who worked in the special access programs office at the various, Air Force locations, wherever they had SAP programs. So this was a tool, and they called it Yankee Blue, and it was a correct, it was a recreation of a special access program dealing with that, like an anti-gravity motor. And if you look at the picture on this, it looked like the classic 1960s UFO with a bunch of bays open and white coated technicians pulling modules out of it. It was used to train their administrative staff on the proper ways to indoctrinate people and read them out. When you get access to these programs, part of that instruction is to teach you how to protect it. So how can you refer to it at different classification levels? How do you store it? What can be said to the public? So they had to have a training tool to do that. Unfortunately, from working with the, what we learned from the Air Force Inspector General's office, that training tool went out into the wild, and it was used as a joke, as a form of harassment. And you had, over 20 years, multiple decades of military and civil servants assigned to the special access management offices all over the world that were never informed that that particular program was false. So you had people that had entire careers read into or read other officers and in and out of that program, and they were never aware it was a false program.
I had another question from a user. Well, I was going to say a Twitter user, but he's a friend of mine on Twitter, Andreas. We call him Craftbeard, but he was saying that John Greenwald FOIA'd documents about Yankee Blue, and I guess he was denied. It was denied, or said there was no record of such a thing given to the Wall Street Journal article. So
I guess that's who he FOIA'd. There was a program called Yankee Blue. I've seen it. It's been investigated at the secretary level, and I briefed it to both the Director of National Intelligence and I briefed it to the Deputy Secretary of Defense.
No, I'm trying to work in questions from the from the audience at the same time, and I thought that was an interesting point. I've always thought FOIA was sort of I hate to say it, sort of a controlled access program where, it's obvious that you don't get everything you want.
Now, if you do a FOIA and the information that you've requested is classified, that is justification not to release it.
Right. They don't say, in some cases, they don't say it's classified. They just say they don't have information about
and they may not have.
Yeah.
That office that was FOIA'd may not have it. We had a person did nothing but work FOIAs almost 100% of the time, and I believe that on the AARO .mil website, they actually have a FOIA reading room where they just put all that. We put a lot of time and effort searching for those records that were disclosed to the public in accordance with the law and put that out there so the public can read, questions that we were asked for or asked of and we responded to.
I have another question about NDAs, and it's sort of it borderlines on the conspiracy side, if you don't mind. I don't know. I wonder if these same interest groups that I'm speaking about, or that I guess I'm theorizing, a lot of my questions based around this idea that I have. I apologize, but it's just, when I have this intuition and perception that I love the line in the Pink Floyd song, Amazing Powers of Perception. I always love that line, but, I feel like some of our I was wondering, okay, so I guess the question is, how do you feel like, or what do you know about the congressional members who are so interested in this? I feel like some of them may have been courted with information, a carrot on a stick sort of thing, and then promised a certain amount of information, but then asked to sign NDAs, to sort of lock up the. I asked this question to Tim Burchett, and he ended up not coming on the next show. That he had already been on my show 3 times, and after I asked the question, So you see, those types of non-answers feed into, these maybe they're wrongful thoughts, but
Well, members of Congress are subject to the same restrictions concerning the disclosure of their access to privileged and classified information.
But is it proper for special interest groups or lobbyists to go to? I mean, you have people who've approached these, Burchett, Luna,
Of course, they're Americans. They have every right to petition their elected officials.
But how are the people who want and think they're going to get disclosure? How can they get it if people are going to Congress people and locking, sort of tying up information with NDAs? That may not have been the original, motivation, but I'm asking. That's a question.
Well, the NDAs are a legal mechanism that we use with criminal penalties if you violate those NDAs to protect our country's secrets. That's why we have them. But if something is classified, we can't share that with the public.
I understand. I guess I'm looking at motive. I would hope that my elected, I'm from Tennessee. Tim's a representative from Tennessee. I don't want my representatives that I'm electing going to Congress and signing NDAs. I think they're only there for 2 to 4 years. If you know what I mean. Well, what good does it do for me to elect someone who? And I'm speaking from a disclosure advocate's side, because I'm a skeptical person.
Sure.
But I'm saying from their standpoint, you have their representatives going to Congress, and they want disclosure from them, and they're not going to get it because these people have signed NDAs.
Well, there are actually they can't get access to the information. One reason that AARO was established by Congress, was put into the law, was to actually have a legitimate organization with the funds and the authority to thoroughly research and kind of bring new understanding into this UAP world. AARO's actually a success. And AARO has the legal authority to absolve you of your NDA, so you can share what you know about a UAP incident. You can, at any classification level, you can brief AARO on what you think or what you saw. And then after the end of that interview, AARO will inform you that NDA is still in effect. It's a lifelong obligation. But you can tell AARO, and members of Congress can actually receive read-ins and get access to sensitive material. And it happens all the time. But access to that information is privileged, and it's given to a member of Congress or a member of the IC for a legitimate purpose. When I left AARO, I got read out on all those programs because I no longer had a need to know. When you go from one assignment to the other assignment, everything that you had access to, you're read out of. I no longer have need, to that information because it's not part of my official duties. So that's how we protect our country's secrets. And most civil servants and military personnel and members of Congress take that very, very seriously.
No, I understand. I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit because, I'm trying to get to the heart of why you won't get disclosure from the government for, ultimately, right? You're only going to, if these things exist, that you're only going to get it from a true whistleblower who hasn't gone through the process of approaching, a government agency or the intelligence, what I mean, you signed an NDA, went into a SCIF, you signed an NDA, now the information that you gave is locked up for 50 years, or whatever. So that's sort of that's my devil's advocate side of this, because I'm a slight skeptic. So
Well, but
I
in
don't.
the National Defense Authorization Act, and I believe it was in 2000, it was 2023, when Congress, directed that AARO, and Sean was the director at the time, to do that historical report based off claims made under oath to Congress that the U.S. government over decades was involved in the recovery and reverse engineering of alien technologies without the authorization of Congress. So AARO was tasked by Congress to examine those claims. And that was the whole purpose of that historical report. There was a legitimate attempt to understand the truth of what actually happened. And there was a lot of time spent, a lot of money spent, a lot of travel, a lot of interviews, to go out there and research these claims. We did have access and cooperation of industry, all those three-letter agencies, the services, the research labs. They opened the doors. One of the things I was amazed at as an intel professional is the transparency, access to very sensitive information that AARO enjoyed. During that investigation, we had, at the time, almost claims of over 40 special access and controlled access programs that people claimed dealt with the recovery, reverse engineering, or exploitation of alien technologies. And every case, we found that those individuals had imperfect knowledge. There were some programs that are actually dealing with the recovery of advanced technology, but those were foreign, technologies exploitation programs where our government was going after somebody else's tech, not alien tech. And we do take incredible measures to protect those operations. We want to protect our people, and we do not want to disclose to our adversaries what we know about their capabilities and the fact that we may, have recovered components of a new rocket or aircraft that they had lost. That's what we saw during our investigation. We never saw any attempt or any legitimate claim that we recovered an alien technology. Now, did we recover capabilities we didn't, or tech or components of a crash that we didn't immediately understand who it belonged to? That probably happened. But in every case, those materials, that technology came from this world, not an alien, advanced society. That just did not happen. We found no evidence to it. And there were multiple attempts or multiple TDYs where we sent our investigators, out to Wright-Patterson Air Force, out to Nevada, out to New Mexico, the various ranges, to examine claims made by individuals, by witnesses under oath to Congress that they saw something. We would send our investigators out there, and they probably, in some cases, they did see things they didn't understand, but it wasn't alien technology that they had imperfect knowledge of. Those were things that our government did want to protect, had nothing to do with exploitation of alien, tech. But there was some legitimacy in what they saw. There actually was a clandestine program. We did have something highly unusual and advanced with amazing performance characteristics. But in every case that we had access to, that we investigated, we found no evidence of something that came from another, universe, another planet, another solar systems. We actually spent a lot of money, embarrassing amount of money, when we had claims of exotic materials that were recovered from UFO crashes. That we did double-blind tests with national labs. We have a great partnership with the Department of Energy, and used a lot of the labs that were the core of the Manhattan Project, where we had properties that claimed, came from another world. We gave them to those labs did not inform them what they were, what the claims were, and asked them to, come back and tell us the composition. What is it that we just gave you? Spent a lot of money, bought a lot of equipment, published a series of material analysis report where we shared. And every case, the materials was something that was made by us and had no extraordinary, any unusual properties that we did not understand. Now, we would love to find an exotic material, that we did not understand. Now, we have legitimate scientists that would love, to write a scholarly, report and get published for finding, a material that came from another, solar systems. We have legitimate scientists that are curious and are open to the possibility that there could be some type of machine that maybe came into our solar system to understand what we're doing. They would love to discover that. We haven't yet.
I had a question I meant to ask earlier about Louis Elizondo and ATIP, and
Sure.
I remember early, it was like a year and a half or 2 years ago, I got into this spat with John Greenwald because he had called Lou a liar over his involvement with ATIP. And I said, well, how do we know that his involvement wasn't sort of off the books? And this kind of goes to this thing I have where some people may be, working as sort of a, contractor. I had several friends who were contractors for, in Afghanistan, right? So they're not military, they're ex-military, they're contractors. And for some reason, I get this intuition that some people are doing work, my comment at the time was, and I made a lot of people mad at me because they said I was just, playing favoritism to Louis Elizondo, which I always thought Lou was a nice guy. I had a good interview with him. But anyway, my thought was that maybe he's not lying. Maybe he did do work for ATIP that was sort of off the books. And I don't think that's an unreasonable thought to have. And I just wondered what you think about that, because, there's still this argument as to.
Sure. Lou is a veteran and a civil servant that served his country honorably. His supervisor, when he was assigned to the Undersecretary of Intelligence and Security on the Office of Secretary of Defense staff, is a personal friend of mine. We go back decades in our professional relationship. I got called up to the DepSec's office because we were contacted by an editor that was working with a guy named John Oliver that had this show on TV. And Lou had made some claims, employment claims and leadership claims of being in the Defense Intelligence Agency, ALSOP initiative, where he claimed he had a leadership role. And we were asked, what were the facts on that? And this was actually their producer verifying claims that Lou made before they went live. So I got called up. The acting undersecretary got called up. We worked with the DOD-IG. We were able to research. We went into this record to determine whether or not there was any record of an assignment working with those DIA organizations. At the time, Lou was a civil servant assigned to the office or working for OSD. He was a DOD employee. He wasn't, he was not an employee of DIA, and those were DIA initiatives. We had no evidence to support Lou's claims, and John Oliver, during that special on TV, never reported those claims. I'll let Lou, speak for himself. I was a civil servant. It's not my job to disparage, the beliefs or opinions
of
American citizens.
I'm not disparaging Lou. As a matter of fact, that's how I got in trouble with certain people. They thought I would,
And
I was taking up for the idea that he could have been doing work, off, I mean, there are people.
Well, I got to say that you don't do work. You don't do work off the books. Okay, to me,
Seriously?
that's an
Really?
indication of a counterintelligence threat. if you have an outside activity, you have to report that as an
But
intel officer.
But it goes to my question earlier about, that's why I sort of seeded the question about what's legal. I mean, is it really illegal for people to do that? Why is it illegal for that to happen if they don't, if they're working directly for, maybe
if
they're
I'm a government employee, I have a remit. I have a duty and I'm tasked to do, and I'll be paid to do that. That's my job. If I have hobbies or other interests outside of my formal duties, you don't do that on government time, and you don't use privileged access or information, okay, to fulfill your fantasies or promote your book. This monetization of this UAP, UFO folklore really alienates me. And I see people come forward where you can pay money to have them opined on UFO incidents or UAP incidents that have been debunked, where people, unbiased people have done examination of the facts and says, no, that's not true. I understand people need to make a living, and they do. And in America, you can say whatever you believe. We do have the First Amendment here.
yeah.
And I don't think it's the role of the government, to attack the beliefs of their citizens unless you're a threat to national security or criminality.
But it's kind of easy now to kind of squash all that into a short period of time. But the book didn't come till, again, I'm playing devil's advocate here. The book didn't come till later, right? Till after all of that activity, all of that work was done.
Sure.
So I'm not, I don't know if that was his original motivation or not. I, I just find it, I look at people. I don't know if you know who Sarah Adams is. She's an ex-CIA analyst who is now doing private intelligence work, and I don't see anything wrong with our government getting intelligence from private. I literally don't see anything wrong with that. I don't understand what the deal, you know what I mean? I don't understand why our government can't sort of
We actually promote that after
yeah.
the raids on those Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Some of the first images actually came from the private sector. I think we're going to have geospatial analysis, even SIGINT, singles intelligence. I think there is a role for the private sector with their expertise and their agility to produce information that the government could use to inform our intelligence production. We really believe in all source analysis. And one of the things that AARO was able to do, since we kind of breached that Title 50 National Intel and Title 10 world, DOD has have access to information at all classification levels and pedigrees. So just because something came from a private sector source or it was unclassified doesn't mean that information is any less valuable than something that a sensor that we as taxpayers spent billions of dollars for, to launch into space and operate is less valuable or has more currency on what it detected than some national system. We're well beyond that, and AARO was able to leverage information from whatever source to help us understand the phenomena. And the intelligence community does that as well. That's part of our trade craft.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that
analytical excellence.
Yeah. I guess what I was getting to was that you could have both sides. You could have, intelligence and counterintelligence being provided by subcontractors. That's just my impression. Okay, I don't have any, and I'm not really talking about AARO per se. I'm not asking if AARO involved those types of activities. I'm saying if you can take intelligence, from Sarah Adams, who's an ex-CIA analyst, and it benefits our country, because she seems to know a lot about movement of terrorists in our own country. You know, what's wrong with the other side of that fence? You know, why can't you
Well,
use why can't you use another interest group to do counterintelligence for you and operate, you know, sort
well,
of
we do leverage now. You know, AARO does leverage the expertise in the analysis of UAP, you know, interest groups. There's a lot of great, legitimate science-based organizations that contribute to our knowledge and improve analytic techniques and data collection. I can remember, I think it was SCU that we used actually gave us a PhD dissertation that was absolutely superb. There's a lot of expertise out there, and I'm the first to admit that the U.S. government does not have a monopoly, you know, on our capabilities to understand UAPs. And I think we really need a large tent, and we need to go after and take you know, data expertise analysis from whoever can help contribute to our understanding. We're a country with, you know, over $30 trillion in debt, and is someone willing to lend the government their expertise and analysis, if it is peer-reviewed science, is legitimate, we should accept it. And I know that's the way you know, AARO is going now. They actually want to do more with the public. I was a big advocate of working with state, local, tribal authorities, especially those first responders that are going to respond to a reporting of UAP incident. So we help them, you know, protect or produce best practices for their investigations, because I want more eyes and ears to help us understand the phenomena. We have a real collection bias. We're somewhat blind in this UAP world because we're looking at it from a national security perspective. We want to protect our secrets and critical infrastructure, and that's where we put our sensors. How about the rest of the country? You know, what is the baseline of activity out there? And to tell you the truth, we probably don't know because we're not looking. And I think if there's a UAP incident, the probability of occurring on state, local, tribal, you know, controlled or governed land is much higher than landing on a DoD installation. And you're going to find here in America, you know, NORTHCOM is going to be the combatant command that's providing, you know, DoD support to civil authorities. You know, if there's a UAP recovery effort, it's going to be DoD with its expertise in security and logistics, force protection. You know, we're going to help a governor or a tribal, you know, official with that. Something falls out of space, there's a lot of hazardous materials, you know, in the propulsion or, you know, the fuel that we need to protect our, you know, citizens of our country from. Or it could be a foreign system that we want to get our hands on so we can understand, you know, their engineering capabilities and in the state of the art and systems that they have. Or we could respond to a UAP incident and we're saying, wait a minute, whatever we have here, we don't understand. What is it? And I think AARO and our national labs and the all-of-government approach is what's going to help us, you know, protect our country, at the same time lead to a better understanding of this UAP phenomenon. We don't know everything. As a national security, you know, expert, I looked at it from a security perspective. You know, why is this thing operating? Why is it here? And what is it doing? We're gonna consider it as foreign tech until we realize it's not. In the same way, when we're out looking for UAPs with what of our pattern of life, you know, collection activities to understand what the baseline is, we detect drones or UASs. Now, when we get those tracks, we get those detections, we're not the UAS police, but we want to give it to that commander or that civilian director that's responsible for security, okay, of their airspace. The same time, if we have a agency or a military organization that has counter UAS systems out there and they detect something that's not a UAS, we want them to immediately transmit that information to AARO so we can understand it. You know, one of the great breakthroughs that we've had since AARO's been established, the cooperation of the Joint Staff to provide instructions to the DoD, and then in parallel, the IC did this through their mechanisms, actually to order them when you have a UAP incident to report it and to protect the data, preservation of data. That's huge. Now we have instructions to government officials to report it, to remove that stigma. At one time, if you had a security clearance and you reported a UFO, you were risking your career and access, to a security clearance. That stigma's been, we want them to report. If you see something unusual, it's part of your duty, the oath you swore to inform us so we can understand that phenomenon. Because the world is way too dangerous of a place to have something operate in close proximity, to operate on forces or critical infrastructure we don't understand.
I know you have a limited amount of time. Let me ask you a question that you and I talked about during our phone conversation. I discovered that we're both Christians, and I think you and I probably have a little bit different opinion on this, which I thought was interesting. Like my take on spirituality and this subject is that, again, I lean towards I feel like that spirituality has sort of been hijacked a little bit to bolster, the phenomenon, or the claims. I think that, religion is a very personal thing, and I don't, we could have a whole show on this. I probably don't have enough time, but I feel like that I had a question. What brought this up was a user named Screen asked me to ask about the plasma, balls or whatever, and those types of things, and how there are claims of, spiritual phenomenon. You know what I mean? And I know you and I probably have a little bit different opinion on this. I don't think that those things are angels or demons. I think that God speaks to us now on a personal basis, individually, through prayer. But that's a whole nother, hopefully sometime you can come back and we can do a whole show on that. But what are your just quick thoughts on that whole thing? I just,
Yeah.
I feel like, go ahead. I'm sorry.
As human beings living on this planet, this time and space, we're constrained by the laws of physics as we understand them. They seem to be pretty universal. However, we're both Christians, so we believe in spiritual things, supernatural things. If you look at your Bible, and some people that I really respect who saw unusual things, there could be a different dimension, that spiritual dimension, where the rules of physics, time and space, are no longer in place, or no longer constraints. And maybe that could explain for some of the observations people have made. I don't know. I'm a Marine and an intel officer, way above my understanding.
Oh, I know. I hate to even, since it is a personal thing, and I just claimed that, this is between you and God, or, us and God. But I just feel like, I guess it gets on my nerves a little bit when people try to use that side of it to promote their own, like, a book or whatever, or a series, seminars. I feel like that you're playing on people's emotions too much, and I don't know. It's something when I was brought up in the church, and we were taught that and I'm not criticizing your term supernatural, but we were taught that after Jesus ascended to heaven, that we were kind of left with this physical realm until we pass away. And see, this gets into a deep subject, and maybe you'll come back sometime. We can talk about, at that point that we're living in a purely physical realm, and that our relationship at that point is purely between us, as individuals, and God, and that there's no mystery. A lot of people try to create this mystery around Christianity, and religion, and there really is no mystery. I don't think that God's going to send balls of light to just hang out in the sky. If you do read the Bible, you'll realize that angels and demons always had a task to perform. Right? They were messengers. They didn't just sort of hover around and create mystery. Right? And so that's where I think I have a issue with that, but I know that's a whole show.
It is, and
Yeah.
maybe we'll bring in the right experts we can discuss it. But AARO did go on the record before Congress and said, "Hey, we have discovered things that we can't explain and we don't understand." So the more analysis we can do, the more data we can collect, and may give us insight to what those are. But I think the government actually was pretty clear that, hey, we don't understand everything about UAPs. And I think
I understand. I wish we would take a more scientific approach to it.
we have.
Yeah,
Absolutely have.
and again,
But we can also admit we don't know everything.
Yeah, all of my comments are not directed towards AARO. I'm speaking in general terms. So that when we see a light, a ball of light, or whatever object, we don't automatically assign a spiritual, aspect to that thing. We try to discern what it is first. Because we're not able to identify these objects, but we're assigning a spiritual meaning to them. Does that make sense?
Sure, and I think that has been the norm of humankind, where there's something they don't understand, that there's this default that we do go to that supernatural spiritual world that give us comfort and understanding about things we do not understand.
Let me see if there are any quick questions I have. What would you have, like, a general closing statement you would like to make about this whole?
Yeah, the one thing I do want to try to convince the American people that the historical report, the research that we do, you've got patriotic Americans that were hired for their professional expertise and honesty, that sons and daughters of Americans across this country that actually worked under a lot of scrutiny and criticism to try to understand UAP phenomena. That there wasn't this nefarious cabal that was trying to hide some covert program from the American people in Congress. I actually give Congress a lot of credit and actually writing AARO into the law and giving AARO the resources and the positional authority to understand what the hell is going on. This is a legitimate, I think to date, very successful attempt by your government, funded by the American taxpayers, to understand this phenomenon. Now, AARO, in the conduct of its operations, as it conducts its mission, is going to discover things that we cannot share with the American people due to the, our need as, civil servants to protect our secrets and not disclose vulnerabilities that we may have. Often when there's a UAP case, the fact that it occurred may not be classified or sensitive, but the location and the time in which it occurred could be very, very sensitive, because we do not want to tell our adversaries, that we're vulnerable, to some surprise or some new capabilities that they fielded. AARO's not perfect at all. Our government's not perfect, but we're working very, very hard with transparency. We really, I think Congress, I'll give Congress another attaboy, is the fact that in the 24 National Defense Authorization Act, they ordered that all UAP information, UFO information, that could be declassified, be passed to NARA so it can be shared, can be assessed, and be examined by the American people. And as a result of that law, AARO's hired a number of full-time analysts that do security reviews and go back to the governing authorities that classified these reports, and to declassify that and share it with American people. There is a legitimate attempt by the government to share as much as we can with the public. Now, when there are things that cannot be shared, from my experience and what I did as, a kid from Tucson assigned to AARO, is nothing that we discovered had anything to do with off-world alien technology. There were things we wanted to protect, but we weren't trying to protect the existence of, aliens. That never occurred during my tenure. And we had no evidence at all to support those claims of people that did want to promote that, were being visited by some sentient, race of people that came from another world. We saw no evidence of it.
I did miss one question here from Andreas. The things that you haven't been able to understand or explain, are they due to the lack of sufficient data, or have any of those cases been high fidelity and data rich cases?
I think it's a mix. I think that we were able to detect things. We were able to develop a track, measure velocity of things that we do not understand. The performance characteristics to date of these truly strange cases did not exceed our understanding of physics or what was operationally capability concerning fielded technology, either by ourselves or allies or adversaries. The fact that a system would be operating controlled airspace or restricted airspace with impunity would be of a lot of concern. I think there's going to be some breakthroughs with optical stealth. There's a lot on minimizing radar cross section, but as we move into more holistic stealth, go to like Arnold's movie The Predator, where there was a cloaking device on the arm of the alien, and you saw that shimmering camouflage of the alien. We know now that there has been the fielding of optical shields that will move photons and mimic the background of the environment you're in, like an octopus or a squid. We think there's going to be some advanced technology as we go from theoretical to engineered solution to production capabilities that are operational. And that's why AARO's role is so vital, to work with the community to ensure that we're not surprised by some disruptive technology that we didn't understand, that we find at our disadvantage. So preventing technological and operational surprise and harvesting all the capability of the government and building a community of interest to actually focus on UAP, I think is very, very useful and vital to both our understanding of technology and science, and also contributes to our national security.
Well, I really appreciate it, Tim. I'm trying to stick to your hour and 40 minutes wish. And I hope that I haven't crossed too many lines, that you wouldn't be willing to come back sometime and delve deeper into some of the subjects. I really appreciate you coming today.
Well, thank you for having the confidence in me and the work that we did to share with the American people. Keep up the good work.
No, I really appreciate. I honestly appreciate all of our civil servants in our military, even the people that work in intelligence.
In our contractors,
and the contractors.
Of course, they were part of the team. And when I was deployed downrange in Afghanistan or some country where a lot of people were trying to kill us, we worked together as an integrated team. One of the things I always get frustrated on these movies about CIA guys overseas, that conflict between the analysts and the contract security folks, that doesn't exist in the real world. We all want to come home from a mission with all our parts alive, still breathing. We work together and we train together as an integrated team. There's a lot of trust and there's a lot of professionalism. And, I honestly believe that we live in the greatest, country on earth. We're not perfect, but working together, we'll get there and we'll make lives, better for both our citizens, but the world, as a whole.
Now, I always get myself in trouble because I think there's a place in our country, our country, and in our military and in our intelligence community for intelligence and counterintelligence. So I'm just trying to understand the roles of that in this particular phenomenon, and I just think it's very interesting. So sometimes my questions may seem far out there, but they just come from a place of pure curiosity. That's all.
I
So
understand. Well, thanks for the opportunity
thank you,
to have this public discussion. I hope it was helpful.
It was very helpful, and I appreciate you spending time with my audience and me. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Out here.
Thanks, Tim.
Out here. Bye.
Bye. Okay, there you go. YouTube, Twitter, UFO Twitter. I tried my best to get all the questions in. I also tried not to interrupt. I get that a lot, but you got to understand these guys are, one thing I learned with Louis Elizondo is that they are trained at not controlling, but being able to speak on subjects for hours, so you almost, if you have 20 questions you want to ask and you only have, an hour and 40 minutes, you have to really try to work them in, and also, viewer questions. So thank you guys, and appreciate all the support. And we will see you in the next show. I hope, my wish is always that guests will be willing to come back. That's always a sign that we did okay.